On a cold morning in 1906, a battleship slid into the waters at Portsmouth. There was no battle raging, no fleet engagement, no smoke on the horizon, and yet within weeks of her launch, more than 24 battleships serving in the world's greatest navies were suddenly considered outdated. Not because they were weak, not because they were old, but because one new ship had changed the way naval war would be understood. And the most remarkable part? The revolution did not lie simply in thicker armor or bigger guns. It rested on a principle so deceptively simple that it quietly dismantled decades of naval thinking. To understand why, we have to step back a few years, back to a time when the great powers believed they had already reached the peak of battleship design. By the end of the 19th century, battleships were awe-inspiring machines. Steel hulls, steam engines, rotating turrets, heavy armor belts. These vessels were not merely weapons, they were floating statements of national power. A typical pre-dreadnought carried 4 large main guns, 2 forward, 2 aft, surrounded by a collection of smaller secondary weapons. The idea was straightforward. If the main guns missed, the rapid-fire secondaries would fill the sky with steel. For decades, this formula worked. But as gunnery improved and ranges increased, a problem emerged. Battles were no longer fought at a few hundred yards, as they had been in the age of Nelson. By the early 1900s, naval guns could reach targets several thousand yards away. At those distances, accuracy depended on spotting, watching where shells struck the water and adjusting accordingly. Here was the flaw. When a ship fired different calibers at once, the splashes looked nearly identical. No one could easily tell which splash came from which gun. At long range, fire correction became guesswork. That was the hidden weakness of the pre-dreadnought system. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. Observers around the world studied the results carefully. One lesson stood out. Large caliber guns firing accurately at range had proven decisive. In Britain, one man paid especially close attention. Admiral Jackie Fisher. Fisher recognized what others had not fully grasped. If long-range gunnery was the future, and if accuracy depended on observing shell splashes, then the logical solution was obvious. All the main guns should be the same caliber, not 4 heavy guns supported by smaller ones, not a mixture, but a uniform battery of heavy guns firing identical shells. It sounded radical. In reality, it was brutally practical. When the new battleship was unveiled, she carried 10 12-inch guns. No mixed battery, no compromise, just concentrated, synchronized firepower. And there was more. Instead of each turret operating independently, her fire was coordinated through centralized electrical control. Data was gathered, calculations were made, and orders were transmitted directly to the guns. In an era when many ships still relied on shouted commands and manual plotting, this was a leap forward. 8 heavy guns could fire together with calculated precision. This was not simply more power, it was organized power. But the true shockwave was psychological. Imagine you are a naval minister in 1906. Your nation has invested millions in a fleet of 15 modern battleships. Then another country launches a vessel that renders your entire force second-rate overnight. The newspapers coin a new term, pre-dreadnought. With one word, your fleet is relegated to the past. The numbers on paper still exist. The ships still float. But the scale has been reset. If your rival possesses 8 dreadnoughts and you have 20 older ships, who truly holds the advantage? The answer is no longer obvious. That was the revolution. When HMS Dreadnought completed her trials at nearly 22 knots, she proved something else. She was faster. Speed in naval warfare is not merely about movement. Speed allows a fleet to choose engagement distance. Speed determines who can maneuver into position. Speed decides who fires first and who can withdraw. And once that standard was demonstrated, no navy could afford to ignore it. HMS Dreadnought did not need to fight a battle to prove her worth. Her specifications were enough: 10 12-inch guns, steam turbines, centralized fire control, 20+ knots. Naval officers across Europe understood immediately. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a reset. The old era had ended, and what no one fully grasped in 1906 was that this reset would not stop at engineering. It would spill into politics. It would reach parliaments. It would alter budgets, and it would quietly push Europe toward a rivalry that would not remain peaceful for long. But before the political storm gathered, there was another element that made Dreadnought different, an element just as decisive as her guns. It was speed. And speed would change the geometry of naval battle itself. 4 knots? On paper, that does not sound like a revolution, but in 1906, a difference of 4 knots could determine who controlled the range, who dictated the maneuver, and who delivered the first devastating broadside. The power of HMS Dreadnought was not only in her 10 12-inch guns, it was in the fact that she could move faster than any battleship afloat. And that speed came from something few navies fully trusted at the time: the steam turbine. To understand why speed mattered so much, we need to understand what naval warfare had become by the turn of the 20th century. For decades, battleships relied on massive reciprocating steam engines. Enormous pistons moved up and down, driving crankshafts that turned propellers through long steel shafts. They were powerful. They were reliable. They were also heavy, space-consuming, and mechanically limited. There was only so fast those engines could safely operate before vibration and strain became destructive. That imposed a ceiling on speed. Most late 19th century battleships could manage 16 to 18 knots, respectable for their day. But Admiral Jackie Fisher saw something others did not. If naval combat was moving to longer ranges, if maneuver and positioning mattered more than ever, then the fleet that could move faster would control the battle. And controlling the battle meant controlling the outcome. Enter Charles Parsons. Parsons had developed a new form of propulsion, the steam turbine. Instead of pistons pumping up and down, high-pressure steam flowed across rows of blades mounted on a rotor, spinning it at extraordinary speed. Fewer moving parts, less vibration, greater efficiency at high revolutions. It was elegant in its simplicity. But installing turbines in a battleship was a gamble. No major capital ship had yet relied entirely on this new system. If it failed, the embarrassment would be national. Fisher took the risk. When Dreadnought underwent sea trials, the result justified the decision. She reached nearly 22 knots. That may not sound dramatic today, but in fleet maneuvering, those additional knots translated into tactical freedom. Speed in naval warfare is leverage. A faster fleet can choose engagement distance. It can refuse battle under unfavorable conditions. It can close the range when advantageous, or keep the enemy at arm's length. And at long range, where heavy guns were most effective, the ability to dictate distance was everything. There was a concept naval officers studied carefully: crossing the T. Imagine 2 battle lines approaching each other. If one fleet could maneuver across the bow of the other, forming a T, it could unleash its full broadside. The opposing fleet, by contrast, could reply only with forward guns. The imbalance was severe, but crossing the T required precise timing and superior maneuverability. A fleet that was even slightly faster had a measurable advantage. With turbines beneath her decks, Dreadnought was no longer just a heavier punch. She was a more agile one. Speed also meant protection. By the early 1900s, a new threat had appeared: the torpedo. Small, fast torpedo boats could threaten even the mightiest battleship. A single successful strike could cripple or sink a capital ship worth millions. The logical counter was to engage at greater distances, beyond the effective reach of smaller attackers. But maintaining that safe distance required speed. A slow battleship could be cornered. A faster one could reposition. Speed became an invisible shield. There was another benefit rarely mentioned outside naval circles. Steam turbines were lighter than the older reciprocating engines they replaced, by roughly 1,000 tons in Dreadnought's case. That weight savings allowed designers more flexibility in armor distribution and internal layout, and turbines produced less vibration at high speeds, which meant a steadier gunnery platform. Accuracy improves when the ship beneath the guns is stable. Thus, speed and firepower reinforced one another. This was not a coincidence. It was integration. When Dreadnought demonstrated her performance, she forced a new question upon the world's navies. If this was the future, how quickly could others adapt? Because speed is not something you can add casually. It affects hull design, machinery space, fuel consumption, maintenance, and escort vessels. One fast battleship demands a fast fleet. Cruisers must keep pace. Destroyers must adapt. Dockyards must expand. A technological shift in one ship becomes a structural shift in an entire navy, and structural shifts are expensive. What made the situation more volatile was that speed translated directly into initiative. The faster navy could patrol farther. It could protect trade routes more efficiently. It could impose blockades or break them. In strategic terms, speed was not merely tactical. It was political. If one nation possessed a fleet capable of rapid concentration and maneuver, it gained a psychological edge. And in an era already defined by rivalry, psychology mattered. By the end of 1906, naval observers understood something profound. HMS Dreadnought was not simply more heavily armed. She represented a fusion of long-range gunnery, centralized fire control, and high-speed maneuvering. She embodied a new doctrine. Battleships were no longer floating fortresses advancing methodically into range. They were instruments of controlled aggression, designed to impose terms rather than endure them. And once that doctrine was demonstrated, it could not be unlearned. No major navy could justify building slower ships. No parliament could argue that yesterday's standard would suffice tomorrow. The clock had started, but speed and firepower were only half the story. The greater consequence was the reaction, because when one nation proves it can build a faster, more powerful class of battleship, others must decide, do we match it, or do we accept inferiority? In 1906, that decision would not remain confined to shipyards. It would reach legislative chambers. It would strain budgets. It would sharpen suspicion. And before long, the competition that began with one ship would evolve into something far larger than naval architecture. It would become an arms race. And that race would not be fought with speeches alone. In 1906, no fleet action shook the oceans. No decisive naval battle unfolded beneath columns of smoke. And yet within 2 years, naval spending in Germany surged dramatically. Debates in the British Parliament grew sharper. Newspapers on both sides of the North Sea warned of a widening dreadnought gap. All of it without a single broadside exchanged. HMS Dreadnought had not yet proven herself in battle. She did not need to. Her existence alone altered the mathematics of power, and once the mathematics changed, politics had no choice but to follow. Before 1906, naval strength was relatively straightforward to measure. How many battleships did a nation possess? How many cruisers? How many tons of armored steel? Britain adhered to what was known as the two-power standard. The Royal Navy was to be at least as strong as the next two largest navies combined. It was an expensive principle, but a clear one. Then Dreadnought entered service. Overnight, a distinction emerged: pre-Dreadnought and Dreadnought. The older ships had not physically changed. Their guns still functioned, their armor still held, but strategically, they had been pushed into a secondary category. It was not simply a matter of counting hulls anymore. Now the question became, how many ships belonged to the new generation? That shift was subtle, but it was transformative. In Berlin, Alfred von Tirpitz understood the implications immediately. For years, he had worked to expand the Imperial German Navy under a series of naval laws. His aim was not necessarily to surpass Britain outright, but to build a fleet strong enough to make war with Germany too costly to contemplate. This was known as the risk theory. But Dreadnought complicated the equation. If Britain possessed a fleet of revolutionary new battleships, then Germany's existing capital ships, even recently built ones, no longer represented parity. They represented an older standard. Parliaments can accept gradual competition. They struggle to accept obsolescence. Tirpitz seized the moment. He argued that Germany could not afford to lag behind in a new category of warship. The Reichstag, previously cautious about naval spending, became more receptive. The logic was difficult to refute. If Britain moved forward, Germany must respond. The same logic operated in London. British policymakers had launched Dreadnought in part to secure continued superiority. Yet the very act of establishing a new standard introduced uncertainty. If Germany accelerated construction, could Britain maintain its traditional margin? Newspapers fueled public anxiety. Editorials warned of a potential shortfall in modern battleships. Political campaigns echoed with slogans demanding more ships and faster production. Naval construction ceased to be a technical matter. It became a question of national security in the public imagination. And public imagination, once engaged, exerts pressure. The crucial point is this: Dreadnought did not merely add strength to Britain's fleet. She reset the baseline. Under the old system, Britain's numerical superiority was clear. Under the new system, every navy had to count only its most modern ships to determine relative power. That recalculation was destabilizing. Imagine investing heavily in a fleet over 10 years, only to be told that its strategic value has diminished overnight. No government wants to admit such a loss in public. The easiest solution is not to defend the old investment. It is to authorize new construction. Between 1906 and 1914, Dreadnought construction accelerated across Europe. Britain built more. Germany built in response. The United States and Japan observed carefully and followed suit. Each launch prompted analysis. Each keel laid down prompted comparison. Naval strength became a visible competition measured in steel and gun barrels. Shipyards expanded, industrial capacity increased. Dock facilities were enlarged to accommodate the larger hulls. Entire supply chains adjusted to meet the demand for armor plate, heavy guns, and advanced machinery. This was not simply naval modernization. It was industrial mobilization in peacetime. And with industrial mobilization came financial strain. Battleships were among the most expensive machines ever constructed at the time. They required skilled labor, specialized materials, and long construction timelines. Every new dreadnought represented a massive commitment of national resources. Yet once one nation committed, the others could not easily decline. To do so risked conceding advantage. Thus, the arms race took on its own momentum. It did not require hostility and daily rhetoric. It required only suspicion and the assumption that the other side would continue building. In that environment, restraint seemed dangerous. Acceleration felt prudent. By the eve of the First World War, the naval rivalry between Britain and Germany had intensified beyond simple ship counts. It had become symbolic. Each new dreadnought signaled resolve. Each delay hinted at weakness. Though many factors contributed to the outbreak of war in 1914, alliances, crises in the Balkans, rising nationalism, the naval competition had helped cultivate an atmosphere of mistrust. When nations spend vast sums preparing for the possibility of conflict, the psychological threshold for conflict lowers. The ships were built as deterrents. But deterrence has a paradox. It requires readiness, and readiness implies expectation. Ironically, by 1914, the original HMS Dreadnought was no longer the most advanced battleship afloat. Newer designs, often called super dreadnoughts, carried larger guns and improved layouts. Her pioneering role had been overtaken by her successors. But that does not diminish her significance. She was the catalyst, the spark that ignited the chain reaction. Without her, the arms race might have unfolded more gradually. With her, it accelerated sharply. The timeline compressed, and compressed timelines increase tension. In strategic history, there are moments when a single innovation forces recalculation across an entire system. HMS Dreadnought was one of those moments. She did not sink fleets. She did not win decisive battles, but she compelled nations to reevaluate their position in the hierarchy of power. And once nations begin recalculating from a position of insecurity, competition intensifies. By 1914, Europe stood on edge. Navies were modernized. Industries were mobilized. Budgets were stretched. The dreadnought race had not caused the war by itself, but it had prepared the ground. And when the crisis finally erupted, the fleets built in reaction to that single ship were ready. Yet there remains a final irony. The vessel that triggered so much construction, so much spending, so much anxiety, would not stand at the center of the war's most dramatic naval engagement. That, too, is part of her story. The ship that reset the global balance of naval power was not present at the largest fleet battle of the First World War. The vessel that triggered an arms race across Europe did not deliver the broadside that decided history. When the guns thundered at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, HMS Dreadnought was not there. She was in refit. At first glance, it sounds like an unfortunate scheduling coincidence. In reality, it reveals something far more telling. The original Dreadnought had already done her job. By 1916, the naval world had moved on. Newer battleships, larger, more heavily armed, better protected, had taken center stage. These super dreadnoughts carried 13.5-inch and even 15-inch guns. Their turrets were arranged more efficiently along the center line. Their armor schemes were refined. In just a decade, the design revolution Dreadnought began had evolved beyond her. This is the fate of pioneers. They are not meant to remain supreme. They are meant to open the door. At Jutland, the clash between Britain's Grand Fleet and Germany's High Seas Fleet validated the dreadnought concept. Heavy guns fired at long range. Maneuver and speed mattered. Centralized fire control proved essential. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically decisive. Germany's fleet never again challenged British control of the seas in open battle, and yet the ship whose name defined the class did not participate. It is tempting to see this as anticlimax, but it is something else. It is proof that the revolution had already taken hold. HMS Dreadnought did see wartime service. In 1915, she rammed and sank a German submarine, U-29, an unusual and dramatic moment. But she was not remembered for a duel of giants. Her impact had occurred earlier, in the realm of doctrine and construction. She had altered how ships were designed, how fleets were structured, and how nations calculated strength. And once those changes were absorbed, newer ships carried the torch forward. There is a broader pattern here. Military history shows that transformative technology rarely dominates forever. The sailing ship gave way to steam. Wood yielded to iron and steel. Mixed batteries yielded to all big-gun battleships. And eventually, the battleship itself would face its own challenger. By the Second World War, aircraft carriers had emerged as the new capital ships of the sea. Air power extended striking range far beyond the horizon. Battleships that once symbolized invulnerability, mighty vessels with thick armor and massive guns, fell to aerial attack. The cycle repeated. A new technology resets the standard. The previous standard becomes vulnerable. HMS Dreadnought had once rendered earlier battleships obsolete. In time, the battleship as a category would face a similar reckoning. But none of this diminishes what Dreadnought achieved. She did not invent the heavy naval gun. She did not invent the steam turbine. She did not invent centralized fire control. What she did was combine them. She fused speed, firepower, and coordination into a coherent system. That integration, at precisely the right moment, changed naval warfare overnight. The nations of Europe did not react because she was slightly better. They reacted because she established a new baseline. And when the baseline shifts, everyone must move or fall behind. By the war's end, HMS Dreadnought had become part of a broader fleet, no longer the singular marvel she had been in 1906. In the years that followed, naval treaties sought to limit battleship construction. The world, exhausted by war, attempted to slow the arms race that Dreadnought had helped ignite. Eventually, she was decommissioned and scrapped, steel recycled, machinery dismantled, a quiet end for a ship whose birth had shaken the world. Yet her legacy did not disappear. Every dreadnought built after 1906, British, German, American, Japanese, owed its lineage to her. Every naval planner who calculated fleet strength in terms of modern capital ships was operating within the framework she created. Her significance was not measured in ships sunk. It was measured in systems transformed. There is a tendency to remember battles over blueprints, to celebrate the thunder of guns more than the drawing board that made them possible. But sometimes the most consequential moments in history occur before the first shot is fired. When HMS Dreadnought entered service, she forced every major power to reconsider its position in the hierarchy of strength. She compelled governments to allocate vast sums. She accelerated industrial expansion. She intensified suspicion between rivals. She did not cause the First World War, but she helped prepare the stage upon which it would be fought. In the end, HMS Dreadnought represents something larger than a single warship. She represents a reset, a moment when technological integration outran established doctrine, a moment when political calculation struggled to keep pace with engineering innovation, and a reminder that in the competition of great powers, standing still is rarely an option. The ship that changed everything did not need to win a decisive battle. Her existence was enough. In 1906, the world's navies awoke to a new reality. And from that moment forward, the race was on.